The Law on Obligations and Contracts by Hector S. De Leon. Article 1170. Those who in the performance of their obligations are guilty of fraud, negligence, or delay, and those who in any manner contravene the tenor, therefore, are liable for damages. Four grounds for liability. First, fraud, deceit, or dolo. It is the deliberate or intentional evasion of the normal fulfillment of an obligation. Let's state an example. An engineer ordered grade 60 reinforcing bars from supplier, but what was delivered was grade 40. The supplier is guilty of fraud and is liable of damages to engineer. Second, negligence, fault, or culpa. It is any voluntary act or omission, there being no bad faith or malice which prevents the normal fulfillment of an obligation. For example, it is one of the responsibilities of the site engineer to ensure that the construction materials for a project are secured and they should be kept in their optimal quality. It is one required that such materials are suspended from the ground to avoid moisture and to avoid corrosion of rebars. The failure to do his duties constitute negligence. Third is delay. The failure to perform an obligation on time. Lastly, contravention of the terms of obligation. This is the violation of the terms and conditions stipulated in the obligation. Not following the terms stipulated in the contract of which both parties agreed can be considered as contravention of the terms of obligation. Fraud may be distinguished from negligence as follows. First, in fraud, there is deliberate intention to cause damage or injury, while in negligence there is no such intention. Waiver of the liability for future fraud is void, while such waiver may in a certain sense to be allowed in negligence. Third, fraud must be clearly proven, while negligence is presumed from the violation of contractual obligation. And lastly, liability cannot be mitigated or reduced by the courts, while liability for negligence may be reduced according to the circumstances. Article 1171. Responsibility arising from fraud is demandable in all obligation. Any waiver of an action for future fraud is void. According to the time of commission, fraud may be past or future. A waiver of an action for future fraud is void, no effect as if there is no waiver, as being against the law and public policy. A contrary rule would encourage the perpetration of fraud because the obliger knows that even if he should commit fraud, he would not be liable for it, thus making the obligation illusory. A past fraud can be the subject of a valid waiver because the waiver can be considered as act of generosity and magnanimity on the part of the party who is victim of the fraud. In the next article, it says responsibility arising from negligence in the performance of every kind of obligation is also demandable, but such liability may be regulated by the courts according to the circumstances. In the performance of every kind of obligation, the debtor also liable for damages resulting from his negligence. There are different kinds of negligence according to source of obligation. First, we have contractual negligence or culpa contractual, or negligence in contracts resulting in their breach. This kind of negligence is not source of obligation. It merely makes the debtor liable for damages in view of his negligence in fulfillment of a pre-existing obligation. Second is civil negligence or culpa achilliana. Negligence which by itself is the source of an obligation between the parties not so related before by any pre-existing contract. It's also called tort or quasi-delict. Third and last is criminal negligence or culpa criminal, negligence resulting in the commission of a crime. The same negligence act causing damages may produce civil liability arising from a crime or create an action for quasi-delict under of the civil code. Thank you, ma'am. That's all. Thank you. Thank you.